My name is Stephen Cady, and I have the honor of serving as the president of Brite Divinity School. It is an institution dedicated to a world transformed by God's love, mercy, and justice. A world transformed by God's love, mercy, and justice. I don't know about you, but looking around our world right now, I think we're in need of some transformation. And in a way, that's what a night like this is for. The Gates of High Lectureship was founded in order to have open dialogue and conversation about issues that pertain to contemporary Judaism, which in my mind pertain to all of us. I can think of few better times in our world than right now to pause and have some open conversation and dialogue. And I'm so glad that you are here to join us for that. I want to say a special thank you to all of the planning team that put this together, particularly to Dr. Feldman for his work in helping to coordinate this evening. I want to say a thank you to those in Jewish Studies, and I want to say a special thank you to Dr. Sommer for being here. What a gift it is to have you here. We're looking forward to your lecture. And to all of you for taking a moment to take that first step.
Sommer or Sommer?
In English I say summer. Summer. In Hebrew I say Sommer.
Introduce Dr. Feldman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cady. Friends, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. But before I do so, I have to thank those who worked very hard to make this event tonight possible. Well, you may know that since its inception, the Gates of High annual lecture has been an endeavor, a joint endeavor, with the Jewish community here in Fort Worth and Brite Divinity School. And the Gates of High committee is at the very heart of this enterprise, this lectureship. So this would be a good moment to say thank you to all of you who have been involved in planning, thinking, and planning again for this event tonight. So if you belong to the committee, could you please stand up for a sec? We will show appreciation for your work. A special word of thanks to Ms. Vanessa Daly. She's somewhere, always busy. Yeah, thank you. I'll show you. She has been so helpful in doing everything behind the scenes. We are appreciative of her work. Ms. Cheryl Cobb, I'm not sure she is here, but she allowed us to use this beautiful and comfortable space. It's really lovely, so thank you, Cheryl. Reverend Lee McCracken resolved all the unsolvable issues and challenges. Thank you for your magic. TCU Hillel students, there are quite a few here. Thank you very much for organizing a dinner for the speaker tonight. And thank you, Professor Jerry Appel. Thank you, Jerry, for taking such a good care of our Hillel group. And finally, very special thanks to Sergeant Eric Aviles and his team from TCU Police. Thank you very much for being with us. We cannot thank you enough. Now, to our speaker, finally. Well, we're honored to have Professor Benjamin Sommer with us here. He's coming to us from Jewish Theological Seminary. If you're looking for a creative scholar who explores Bible critically, and yet with a deep appreciation for centuries-long Jewish learning of the Hebrew Bible, Professor Sommer is your man. Here he is. He has been described as both a traditionalist, I don't know what that means, by the way, and an iconoclast, someone who shatters idols and prejudices, but also nurtures Jewish tradition. Professor Sommer teaches at Jewish Theological Seminary, the flagship of the conservative movement, and prior to it, he taught for 13 years at Northwestern University. There is a long list of publications. If you would like me to recite all of them, I can do that. But probably I'll just name two books he's published recently: Revelation and Authority, Sinai in Jewish Scripture and Tradition, what a wonderful title. And another better one, The Bodies of God and the World of Ancient Israel, what a wonderful title. Both are groundbreaking books, and there is a forthcoming commentary on the Book of Psalms in the excellent and important Jewish Publication Society commentary series, which we're waiting for to appear. But tonight it's all about Afterlife, Hebrew Bible and Afterlife, Misconceptions and Reconsiderations. Please welcome Professor Sommer.
Thank you.
Thank you to my colleagues. Thank you to the committee that put this together, and thank you to everybody who has shown up tonight to hear about the afterlife in the Hebrew Bible. It's really a pleasure to be back here on the TCU campus after, I think, 14 years. I was last here to teach an intensive summer course back in the summer of, I think it was 2010. And I think my effect on the community has not always been fully recognized. So I'd like to pause to note this. I taught here in the summer of 2010. 6 months later, on January 1st, 2011, what happened for the first time ever? TCU went to the Rose Bowl for the first time ever. Just a coincidence? I joined the Northwestern faculty, whatever year it was that I got my PhD, and about 3 months later, Northwestern went to the Rose Bowl for the first time in 43 years. I can only hope that my presence tonight for this lecture has a similar effect this upcoming season. And we can only, especially those of us, I know there are some JTS graduates in the audience, we can only regret that if only the Jewish Theological Seminary had a football team, we would have gone to the Rose Bowl in 2008, which would have just been unprecedented. But I'm not here to talk about football, which is a good thing since I know nothing about football. I'm here to talk about what the Hebrew Scriptures say about the afterlife. And there's a handout that we'll be using that people have on their, I think all the seats have them. There are a few copies if people are interested with some of the texts available in Hebrew and Aramaic. Professor Feldman has those in the back, so people whose Hebrew and Aramaic is strong, I'm expecting to see at least the graduate students get up at this point, might want to go and grab that one. So, as we've heard, this is a lecture about what the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures say about life after death. And many of you may be expecting a very short lecture, in that many people believe that the Hebrew Bible doesn't have any doctrine of life after death. The idea of either immortality or resurrection is a post-Hebrew Bible idea that emerges in Second Temple period Judaism and becomes prominent in early Christianity and in Rabbinic Judaism. But it's the going consensus is that there is no such idea in the Hebrew Bible. And what I'd like to do tonight is I'd like to challenge that consensus. I'd like to point out that the evidence from the Hebrew Bible is more mixed and more complicated. It's more mixed, first of all, because it's hard to talk about any one particular view of the afterlife in the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible is an anthology. It's not a book of doctrine that teaches any one thing. It's an anthology of ancient Israelite religious literature that often is in debate with itself, that is in dialogue with itself. That's why actually I chose a slightly different title in the handout from what was advertised. I decided to use the phrase Hebrew Scriptures in the plural, first of all, just to emphasize that fact about the Hebrew Bible, about the Old Testament, that it's an anthology, not a book, and it often has many things to teach, sometimes contradictory ideas to teach about many important topics. So what I'd like to do tonight is I'd like first to look at some ideas about the afterlife that were common among the ancient Israelites' neighbors and their ancestors in the land of Canaan, in Mesopotamia, generally in the ancient Near East. That's number one. Then I'd like to look at some biblical texts, and I'd like to point out that, surprisingly enough, when you read the biblical texts in light of some of the ancient Near Eastern texts that we'll be looking at tonight, you suddenly realize that there are biblical authors and characters who sort of offhandedly make reference to what were very, very common ideas among the Israelites' ancestors and neighbors, and they seem to have had basically the same conception of the afterlife. So number one, we're going to look at ancient Near Eastern texts to see what their conception is. Number two, we're going to see that the same conception shows up in at least some texts of the Hebrew Bible, which shows us that at least some Israelites did have a concept of the afterlife. And then number 3, I'd like to take a look at how that idea of the afterlife endures but is transformed in later Judaism and Christianity. And we'll take a look at one particular very famous Jewish text that, on the one hand, picks up on the ancient Near Eastern ideas that were common I think were common in ancient Israel, but also modifies them in a significant way. So those are the 3 things that we're going to do: ancient Near East, Bible, and then post-biblical Judaism and Christianity, and especially one famous post-biblical Jewish text. Before we do any of that, though, before we do numbers 1, 2, and 3, we've got to do number 0, which is, I'd like to acknowledge why people have the, I think, misimpression that the Hebrew Bible doesn't have any idea of an afterlife. That is the widespread conception, and that widespread conception doesn't come out of nowhere. There's a reason that people have that impression or that misimpression. There are really 2 types of reason. Number 1, which I didn't put onto the handout, is that the Hebrew Bible doesn't talk much about the afterlife, even where you thought it might have. The Hebrew Bible is a theological work. It talks about a lot of major religious ideas, and there is no section of the Hebrew Bible devoted to a discussion of the afterlife. So in a sense, for this handout to be more accurate, it might have been a good idea just to start with like 5 blank pages. The Hebrew Bible has plenty to say about monotheism, and it's got plenty to say about the nature of worship and the nature of prayer. It has plenty to say about reward and punishment and what is the nature of true piety, but there's no sections of the Hebrew Bible that correspond to the sections that deal with monotheism or worship or what is the nature of true piety. You go and look for a chapter, a paragraph, much less a book that's about the afterlife, and it's just not there. So number 1, I'll acknowledge that the authors of the Hebrew Bible, minimally, we can agree, they don't want to talk about the afterlife. I don't think that that's because they didn't believe in it, but I think that they didn't want to talk about it. And at the end of the lecture, I'm going to come back to that idea. Why didn't they want to talk about it? But they don't devote much attention to it. Where they do devote attention, it's kind of just in passing while talking about something else. So the piece of evidence number 1 that leads to the misimpression that the ancient Israelites didn't have an idea of the afterlife is that the biblical authors don't talk about it, and I think that there's a specific reason that they didn't want to talk about it. That's number 1. Number 2, there are a number of biblical passages that give the impression, or could be read, as a denial of an afterlife. So let's take a look at a few of those verses and see what we can make of them. I've given just a few examples at the beginning of the handout. So starting with Psalm 115, there's a few lines here. I'll read these from the New JPS translation. The heavens belong to the Lord, but the earth he gave over to man. The dead cannot praise the Lord, nor any who go down in silence. But we, the living, will bless the Lord now and forevermore. Hallelujah. So the dead cannot praise the Lord. This could be understood as a denial that people who are dead can do anything. That is, that people who are dead continue in some way to exist. You get a very similar line in Psalm 6. A person in trouble says, O Lord, turn, rescue me, deliver me as befits your faithfulness. For there is no praise of you among the dead. In Sheol, who can acclaim you? Here again, this idea that the dead can't praise you, the dead don't praise you, and then in Sheol, no one praises you. Sheol being some sort of word for where the spirits of the dead go, where humans, or what's left of a human being, goes after death. So this line, at first glance, like the line from Psalm 115, could give the impression that the dead don't exist, but on the other hand, if they go somewhere, if they're in Sheol, well, maybe they do exist. What may be going on, I think, in these lines, actually, is not so much a denial of life after death, but it seems to be maybe a denial of life, a denial that the Lord, and actually the Hebrew text here doesn't actually say the Lord, it just gives God's personal name in Hebrew, which was spelled with the letters Y, H, W, and H, which in Jewish tradition we don't pronounce out loud. But that personal name is what the Hebrew text has here. And they seem to be saying that, well, this God, I'll use the word Hashem, which just means the name in Hebrew, to represent the name that I'm not saying out loud following Jewish tradition, but I prefer saying Hashem rather than the Lord to give the impression that it is in fact a name. They seem to be saying, well, Hashem is a great God, but the realm of the dead is outside of Hashem's realm because Hashem is a God of life. I think that that's what's going on in these verses. They're not denying that the dead go somewhere, but they're denying that that place is relevant to Hashem, which if you stop and think about it really, is an idea that is not so easy to reconcile with true monotheism. I think that these verses are an example of the Bible's attempt to work towards a full monotheism. I think generally speaking the Bible gets there, but we can see that during the time during which the Bible was composed and put together, ideas are developing. There's more than one idea about various issues. And I think that while the Bible always wants to be monotheist, I think that there are portions of the Bible that don't quite fully succeed. And there are respects in which it's only later Jewish philosophy that maybe fully makes it to a full-fledged monotheism, in part because of the assistance of Greek philosophy and Arabic language philosophy, and the influence of Greek philosophy through Arabic philosophy on Judaism gets finally to, I think, a more self-consistent, fully fledged monotheism. In the Bible, we're not always quite there. I think that these verses would be an example of that semi-successful monotheism. There's an idea that there's one deity, but that deity doesn't really have control over the realm of the dead. So I don't think that these verses are necessarily denying that there's an afterlife. I think that they're denying that the God of Israel, the creator God, is relevant to the afterlife. But if there's a place called Sheol, well then apparently the dead kind of do sort of go somewhere. There are a lot of other references to this place called Sheol in the Bible. I give you just one or two more examples. In Genesis chapter 37, Jacob has been told incorrectly that his son Joseph is probably dead. He's been ripped apart by beasts and there's no body left, just some blood. And he believes this story that his other sons tell him. And he's very, very upset. His sons and daughters seek to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, "No, I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol." Thus his father wept for him. So Sheol is somewhere where he's going to go. And actually we're seeing here something that becomes evident if you look at every single reference to Sheol in the Bible, which we won't do tonight. But if you look at all of them, Sheol is almost always where somebody who dies a troubled death goes. If you have a bad death, you go to Sheol. One example of a bad death would be a father who lost his beloved son. The rest of his life is going to be troubled, and therefore his death will be troubled. So he'll go to this kind of bad place called Sheol. But it's not so clear, actually, that everybody goes to Sheol. Sheol seems to be where you go if there's something about your death which is especially troubled or troubling. But what we're seeing here is, well, there does seem to be some sort of idea of an afterlife, and one aspect of that afterlife is this unfortunate place called Sheol. On the other hand, there are a few other places in the Bible that might seem to refer to a realm of the dead in a more positive way. Psalm 133 at the bottom of page 1 refers to how the Lord ordained blessing and everlasting life. Well, everlasting life, we might debate what exactly the Hebrew here means, but it does sound like some sort of life that would continue forever. In other words, continues after we die. It's interesting, by the way, that line about everlasting life immediately follows a line that mentions dew. We'll find that dew is often associated with everlasting life, or at least relatively often in ancient texts, the ancient Hebrew texts. We see that in the next passage at the top of page 2, where there is a reference to God reviving the dead, and this is compared to what dew does for vegetation. What God does by sending dew, especially remembering we're talking about the land of Israel, a very, very dry area where there is no rain whatsoever from about October through April. Dew is very, very important in the land of Israel. It revives plants on a daily basis, and God might revive us human beings, perhaps in a similar way. One other reference, so Isaiah 26, with this reference to letting the dead be revived, this does seem to be a reference to life after death. It's pretty clear. The truth is, though, that it's one of the only clear references to life after death, really clear, positive references to life after death in the Hebrew Bible. And it's from a chapter that many scholars can believe is one of the later chapters in the Hebrew Bible, post-exilic. It's a fairly late strata of the Bible. And then we get another reference to life after death in Daniel chapter 12. This is one of the latest texts found in the Hebrew Bible. I think the book of Daniel in its current form is probably by far the latest text in the Hebrew Bible. And there is a reference to a time of great trouble, which will end, however, happily, because after this time of trouble, I'm on the third line there from Daniel, your people will be rescued. All who are found inscribed in the book will be rescued. Many of those that sleep in the earth will awake, some to eternal life, others to reproaches to everlasting abhorrence. So the dead will come back to life. Some will be rewarded, some will be punished, and the knowledgeable will be radiant like the bright expanse of sky, and those who lead the many to righteousness will be like stars forever and ever. So just like stars shine forever, people will come back to life and then live forever. This is a pretty clear reference to the resurrection of the dead, what becomes a standard idea in later forms of Judaism, becomes a standard idea in early Christianity. It is, I think, a clear reference. It's interesting, though, that it's one of the only ones in the Bible. It's the clearest one, and it's appearing in what is genuinely the latest text in the Hebrew Bible. So we can see why the idea would have gotten going that maybe the Israelites didn't believe, or biblical authors, for the most part, didn't believe in the afterlife. There are a couple of clear exceptions that we saw here on page 2 of the handout. And when we look a little bit more closely at some of the other evidence for the idea that there's no idea of an afterlife, I think it turns out that it's not quite so clear. It's a little more foggy. What is striking is that this religious anthology, this anthology of religious literature, it never really addresses the question of what happens to people after they die at any length in any systematic way. What I'd like to do now is leave the Bible for a little bit and take a tour of the ancient Near East. In particular, we're going to be looking at texts from two areas. One is what we call the Northwest Semitic sphere. That is to say, we're going to look at some literature and evidence from ancient Canaanites and from ancient Aramaic speakers. So these are people who lived in what is today Israel, Lebanon, Syria, the Palestinian territories, the western part of Jordan, and even a little bit in Turkey, the southeastern part of Turkey. Northwest Semites who spoke the Canaanite language. Canaanite was a language family. Hebrew is a Canaanite language. Phoenician is a Canaanite language. There's something called Ugaritic we're going to look at, which is probably Canaanite or very closely related, or people who spoke Aramaic. Aramaic is another Northwest Semitic language related to Canaanite/Hebrew, but a different language. Then we'll also look at some evidence from ancient Mesopotamia, that is to say, roughly where Iraq and parts of Syria and Turkey are today. Texts that were written in the language known as Akkadian, Akkadian was the language of the Babylonian Empire and the Assyrian Empire. And what we're going to see consistently from these texts is that they seem to have an idea of the afterlife according to which life after death is precarious, but sons and a good burial and maybe having your name or your legacy associated with a particular plot of land helps secure a good afterlife. So there is an afterlife, but it's precarious. You're not going to get it if you don't have a good burial. You may not get it if you don't have sons who somehow will help you get an afterlife. And you may not get it if you don't have a plot of land associated with your name and with your legacy. But if you've got those three things, or maybe even just one of those three things, then you can have a good afterlife. This is an idea that we see among the Northwest Semites and among the Mesopotamians. We'll see a few examples. By the way, you're noticing perhaps I'm not going to ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptian literature, ancient Egyptian art, ancient Egyptian religion has a very well-developed idea of an afterlife, but this doesn't seem to be the idea that the Israelites adopted themselves. The Israelites' neighbors and ancestors were Canaanites. They had ancestors who came from Mesopotamia, and it's the Canaanites, the Arameans, and the Mesopotamians, the Babylonians and Assyrians, whose ideas about the afterlife the Israelites seem to have just assumed. There's a different, very, very interesting set of ideas about the afterlife among the Egyptians. That doesn't seem to be the one that really influences the Israelites. So let's look at some ancient Near Eastern texts from the Northwest Semites and from Mesopotamia. We'll start with a 5th century Phoenician inscription from the city of Sidon or Sidon. I'm just going to read this. This is a grave inscription. So this was on top of a person's sarcophagus, that is his stone coffin. What was written on top of this sarcophagus is as follows. I, Tavnit, priest of Astarte, king of the Sidonians, son of Eshmunazar, priest of Astarte, king of the Sidonians, I lie in this coffin. Whoever you are, any man at all who come upon this coffin, you must not open up what is over me or disturb me. For they did not gather any silver for me, they did not gather any gold for me, nor any riches. In other words, I know there are grave robbers out there. I got nothing. Move on. This is not worth your trouble. Only I myself lie in this coffin. You must not open up what is over me, nor disturb it, for such is an act of abomination to the goddess Astarte. But if you in fact open up what is over me and do disturb me, may you have no seed among the living under the sun, nor resting place with the shades. No resting place with the shades. The Phoenician word for shades, for those of you who know Hebrew, the Phoenician word here is Riphaim, the same word that we find showing up in the Bible to refer to some sort of race of magical giants or something. So there's this idea here, don't open it up, there's nothing here, I can't help you. There's this fear that if somebody opens up the grave and disturbs the remains of the body, disturbs the skeleton, that's going to mess up his afterlife. And some of these, there are a number of Phoenician inscriptions that use this kind of language. For some of you, if you happen to have the original Phoenician, it's on the top of page 3. The language here is interesting. Al tiftach alati va'al tirgazeni. A more literal translation than the one that I'm quoting from by Professor John Gibson would be, don't open it up. Al tiftach, don't open it up. There is this real fear, you're going to mess up, I think it's that you're going to mess up my afterlife, so please just leave me alone here. So we're seeing here, there is an afterlife, but it depends on bodily integrity. If the bones get messed up, the afterlife is damaged. Going back in time, but staying with the Northwest Semites on page 2 of the English version of the handout, this is from an epic poem from ancient Ugarit, a Canaanite city on the coast of Syria, just south of what is now the Turkish border, which talks about a man or a king named Daniel or Daniel, the man of the Rapi'u or the Riphaim. It's the same word that we saw in the text from Sidon, a word that appears in the Bible. And this man, Daniel, has no son, like his siblings, no offspring. And that's a tragedy, as we keep on reading, because, well, the speaker here says, let him have a son in his house, offspring within his palace, to do certain things for him. And we're going to get here a list of filial duties. What is it that a son does for a father? The first thing it says is to set up his divine ancestor's stele. In other words, to raise a grave marker for him. That's the first thing a son needs to do for his father. The sign of his kinsman in a sanctuary, to rescue his smoke or his spirit. The Ugaritic here is ruch, cognate to ruach in Hebrew, to raise his smoke from the underworld, to protect his steps from the dust. So part of what a son does, I think, is that by raising up the stele, by giving him a good burial and a good grave, he ensures that what remains of his father won't stay in the dust forever, but will have some better fate. If you don't have a son to do this for you, you're just going to live in the dust, and that's probably not a pleasant way to spend eternity. If you've got a son who gives you a grave, then you've got a chance for a better afterlife. And then it goes on to describe some other responsibilities, some of which are responsibilities during the father's lifetime that a son has to take care of. But I'm interested, especially in these opening lines, that I think refer to the son's responsibility when the father dies. There are some other texts that I didn't translate here. They're kind of very long legal texts. But we have from Mesopotamia, actually, in Akkadian, a great number of contracts between slave owners and a particular slave who is adopted as a son. And that slave becomes the legal heir of the childless slave owner, some man and some woman, and the responsibilities of the former slave as a child, as an adopted child of the slave owners are then listed quite explicitly. They've got to take care of the person who is now legally their father when they're older and they can't take care of themselves. And then specifically, they've got to give the person a good burial and make sure that the burial place stays in good condition. And by doing that, they are described as respecting their adopted father and mother. The word for respect here is mukabid in Akkadian, which is going to be cognate to the Hebrew word lichabed or michabed or kabed in the imperative. We're going to see that verb again later in this lecture, so we want to remember that word for respect, which really means to treat as substantial or maybe even to give substance. And I think one of the responsibilities is you give substance to your dead ancestor, even an adopted ancestor, an adopted father and mother. You give substance to them in Mesopotamia by feeding them on a regular basis, on a particular festival once a year, probably the anniversary of their death. When you feed them at their death, you're being respectful to them, you're a mukabbid, but you're also, I think, to translate it more literally, you are giving them substance. If nobody feeds them, they'll get like really thin and skinny, right, in the afterlife. But if once a year somebody pours some nice water, some wine, some olive oil into their grave, then they'll be okay. We have references to this custom. It was known as the kispu ceremony in other texts as well. To give an example on page 3 of the handout, I've got a text from a prayer to one's dead ancestors. The person praying here addresses them, "You, the ghosts of my family, the progenitors of mine who are in the grave, my father, my grandfather, my mother, my grandmother, my brother, my sister, my family, my kin, my clan. As many as are sleeping in the netherworld, I make a funerary offering to you. I pour out water to you. I lavish care upon you. I glorify you. I honor you." That verb for honoring is again that word that could be translated as to give substance to, from the same shorish as the Hebrew word kabed. It's the responsibility of the family to take care of their ancestors, which they do by pouring water into the grave. In other texts, they pour olive oil or they pour wine. There are graves that archaeologists have discovered in Mesopotamia that have tubes going down into the grave. Archaeologists have scraped away the stuff on the tubes and given it to chemists and found that it's olive oil and it's a grape product. It's probably wine. It's grape wine or grape juice. This was something that you were supposed to do for your ancestors. You were supposed to feed them. And then if you go on and glance at the rest of this prayer, there's a kind of tit-for-tat relationship. I'm taking care of you, and I'd like you to take care of us. There was this idea that, well, now that your dead ancestors are in this other realm, if they're in a good condition there, they can intercede on our behalf. They might know somebody in this other realm who knows somebody, who's friendly with somebody, who knows Marduk's cupbearer, Marduk being the king of the gods. And it's more effective theoretically to just pray to Marduk, except why would Marduk want to listen to little old you? Marduk is the king of the gods. He listens to the king of Babylon. He's really not that interested necessarily in somebody else's, some regular person's prayer, but you can pray to your dead grandfather or your dead father or your dead great-great-grandfather. Even if you never knew your great-great-grandfather, you take care of his grave, and maybe now he'll take care of you where he is, he can go and talk to somebody and maybe get something done. So there's this relationship in which you're offering them food, you're offering sacrifices to them, you're praying to them, and you're hoping that they will then intercede on your behalf. A few more texts just to get a little bit more evidence here on the table. The Panamua inscription, this is an 8th century text in Aramaic from Zinjirli in what is today Turkey. A king, Panamua, says the following: I am Panamua, son of somebody, Karl or something, we don't know how to pronounce that, king of some place, who has raised this statue. The word here for statue in Aramaic is nitzab or nitzav. Some of you, if you know Hebrew and know the Hebrew word for gravestone, you know that it's matzeva. It's from the same root. It's the Hebrew form of the word would be matzeva, and the Aramaic form is nitzav. I've raised up this statue for Hadad. Now, if one of Panamu's sons should grasp the scepter and sit on my throne and maintain power and do sacrifice to this Hadad, to this god represented by this statue, let my son, the new king, say the following: may the soul, this is nabshu or nevesh in Aramaic, cognate to nefesh in Hebrew, may the soul of Panamu eat with you, and may the soul of Panamu drink with you. Let him keep remembering, yizkor, the soul, nefesh, of Panamu with Hadad. So the responsibility of the son of the king, after the king dies, is to worship the god Hadad, also known as Baal, at this statue, and to pray on behalf of his father. The son should pray to Baal at this statue and say to Baal, please remember, yizkor, the nefesh of the soul, the nefesh of my father. May my father eat with you, and may my father drink with you. Again, there's this concern that, like, how do you eat and drink in the afterlife? Well, here the idea seems to be, if your son prays to Baal, the king of the gods as far as the Northwest Semites were concerned, well then your dad will be okay, Baal can take care of it. But you've got to remind Baal to do this. Another inscription from right nearby from the same time period is from a servant of this king. Let me just read that at the bottom of page 3. I am Katamua, servant of Panamua, who acquired for myself this stele, nitzab, it's that same word, while still alive, bechaya is the Aramaic, and I put it in my eternal reception room. The festival offering of this reception room is as follows, and then he gives a list of different offerings that should be offered here on some regular basis. A ram for the god Hadad, a ram for the god Kubala, and at the top of page 4, a ram for my soul, nabshi, which is in this stele. So this stele, this nitzab, somehow houses the soul of the dead father, and on some regular basis, it's probably once a year, you want to make an offering, you want to offer a ram to the soul of your dead father that is inside of this stele, this stone, this vertical stone that's been set up, this nitzab, or nitzav in Aramaic, and somehow by doing that, the soul of your father is going to end up being in a better situation. At the very, very end of this text, it talks about how every year, let him, my son, slaughter an animal beside my soul or for my soul and present me with a thigh. The piece of meat that he gets specifically is the thigh. And then your dead father will have an okay afterlife because you're feeding him once a year. Once a year seems to be probably enough for dead people. Let's look at one more text. This is from the Gilgamesh epic in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the most famous pieces of ancient Near Eastern literature. At the end of the Neo-Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, King Gilgamesh, meets his sidekick and friend Enkidu, who has died and gone down into the netherworld. But he's able to meet with him and talk with him, and he says, Enkidu, what's it like down there? And he finds out the following. Gilgamesh asks his friend Enkidu, did you see the one who died a natural death? Enkidu responds, I saw him. He lies drinking clear water on the bed of the gods. He's got clear water to drink, he's okay. Gilgamesh asks, "Did you see the one who was killed in battle?" And Enkidu replies, "I saw him. His father and mother honor his memory, and his wife weeps over him." "Did you see the one whose corpse was left lying in the open countryside? Maybe he fell in battle, maybe he was killed by animals or something, and he never got properly buried." "I saw him," Enkidu says. "His ghost does not lie at rest in the netherworld." "Did you see the ghost who has no provider of funerary offerings?" The term here is pakid, which is going to be similar to the Hebrew verb poked. "I saw him. He eats scrapings from the pot and crusts of bread that are thrown away in the street." There's another text, I won't read through it. The next text also is an ancient Mesopotamian text in Akkadian that also mentions this office, this job. It's somebody's job to be the pakidu, in Hebrew you would say the poked, of a dead person. And if you've got somebody who is your pakidu, you'll be okay. You can drink clear water, you'll have something to eat. If you don't have a pakidu, you're going to be in real trouble. Maybe you're lucky and you get a crust of bread once in a while. So probably it's the responsibility of family, especially a son, to be the pakidu. And if you've got a pakidu after you die, you'll have an okay afterlife. So the basic idea of this ancient Near Eastern idea of the afterlife is if you've got sons who can take care of your grave, if you've got somebody making offerings at your grave, and also if you just have a grave, if your body is fairly intact in the grave, you can have a good afterlife. If you don't have one of these things, or maybe you don't have a bunch of these things, then you're going to end up having a very unpleasant afterlife. What's interesting when you go through these texts and you pay attention to their vocabulary, the exact wording, you go back to the Bible, and all of a sudden there are these throwaway lines here or there that you realize are just pregnant with meaning. That to the ancient Israelites, they all got it. They understood what these lines were saying, but maybe a lot of us, when we're reading through the Bible quickly, we just don't notice it. So let's look at it. I'll just give a few examples of these. From 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 18, there's a reference to David's son, Avshalom, or Absalom. Avshalom didn't actually have children of his own, and we're told the following. Avshalom, in his lifetime, Bichayav, in the Katamua inscription, you might remember that the person said, "I erected this nitzav, this stele, during my lifetime." Maybe that's technical legal vocabulary of a certain type, or ritual vocabulary, because we read Absalom, in his life, Bichayav, acquired this pillar, Matseva, which is in the Valley of the King, and set it up for himself. It's the exact same vocabulary that Katamua was using. Absalom actually probably would have lived about 2 centuries earlier. Whoever's writing the book of Samuel, we don't really know for sure when it was written. It might have been actually at about the same time as Katamua, maybe even a century or 2 later. But it's from the same cultural orbit, the same area, and it's using the same vocabulary. That's not a coincidence. And we hear that Absalom said, "I have no son to pronounce my name, Hazkir et Shemi." This is using the same Semitic root that the Aramaic Panamua inscription used. We're told there that the son should keep remembering, Yizkor or Yazkir, we don't know for sure what the vowels were. The son should Yazkir, remember or mention the nefesh, the soul of his father. Well, here, Avshalom is saying, I've got no son to mention or to remember my name. It's the same vocabulary used in that Aramaic inscription. So instead, I'll have this monument. Somehow this monument will take the place of having a son who mentions his name. Maybe people go by the monument and they'll just say, "Oh, that's where Absalom, David's son, is buried." And somehow there's a magical power to the mention of the name. He knows he doesn't have sons. At least somebody else will mention the name when they see this monument, when they see this matzevet, which matzevet being the Hebrew form for what in Aramaic was called the nitzav. We're getting the same conception of the afterlife here. If you don't have a son, you're in trouble, but you can do something to maybe try to make up for that absence. Actually, the Katamua inscription even says, "Whoever owns this piece of land of mine, if it ends up not being a descendant of mine, do this anyway, okay? It's my land. Please respect this monument and give an offering once a year that will keep my nefesh in a state of good repair, will keep my soul in a state of good repair. One other example of this, it's a little bit longer, so I didn't put it on the handout. In the book of Numbers, there's a well-known passage, or actually, maybe it's well-known, maybe people have PhDs in Bible, I think it's well-known. Anyway, there's a passage that talks about the daughters of a man named Tzlofchad, or Zelofechad or something in English. In Hebrew, Tzlofchad, and he has 6 daughters, but no sons. And therefore, his descendants will not get a piece of the land of Israel. There will be no piece of real estate assigned to them because only sons get assigned real estate. And the daughters complain about this. And they say to Moses, why should our father suffer just because he didn't have sons? Let us inherit the land. A lot of us, I think, like reading this passage nowadays because we see the 6 daughters as kind of proto-feminists asking to be able to get something similar to what sons get, which is a great reading of the passage for our religious needs nowadays, but I don't think that that's the main point of the daughters' complaint. The daughters are worried about their father. If there's no son to inherit a piece of land that is associated with his name, I think what they're worried about is he won't have a good afterlife. There's no son, lahazkir et shemo. There's no son who's going to mention or remember his name. And when in the Katamua inscription, mentioning a name is something that you do along with making an offering from the man's land, from the farm that used to belong to him. You take a sheep or a lamb or a ram, you offer it to the deceased person there, and that's what helps keep him alive and having a pleasant afterlife. The assumption that I think Tzlofchad's daughters are making in the book of Numbers is, well, there won't be a piece of land to keep his name alive. That's not fair to him just because he had daughters. Let us inherit the land, and that will, I think that the unstated idea there is that will give our father a good afterlife. The whole assumption of that story is based on these Northwest Semitic and Mesopotamian ideas of the afterlife. Just one more biblical text on page 5, on that last page. A familiar one, honor, Hebrew kabed, honor your father and mother, that you may long endure on the land that the Lord your God is assigning to you, from the 10 Commandments, from the Decalogue. What does that mean, to honor your father and mother? By looking at the same verb as it appears in Akkadian, kubbud as opposed to kabed, but it's the same root, it's the same letters. I think that kabed here, what they're talking about is the same thing that prayer to the dead ancestors was talking about when they say to the dead ancestors, we're honoring you. I think that part of it is we're giving you substance by feeding you. We're keeping you alive, therefore please do something for us. What we're reading here is maybe the same idea. Or I mentioned those contracts in which an adopted son has the responsibility of honoring the 2 parents, the mother and the father. And that's spelled out specifically that one of the aspects of honoring them is giving them a good burial and keeping their grave in good shape. I think that part of what's behind the Decalogue here, when it says honor your father and mother, that's not just something you do while they're alive. You have to keep on doing it. In fact, most significantly, you have to keep on doing it after they die. And it may be that you're doing something ritually to keep them alive in some other realm, to give them substance, to make sure that they're not too thirsty and that they're not too hungry in this other realm. So I think when you go to a number of biblical passages, we've seen just a few of them, it turns out that the Israelites probably shared the common Northwest Semitic and Mesopotamian idea about the afterlife, but they didn't talk about it much. So I want to address the question, well, if they believed in this, why don't these religious texts talk about this idea? And I think it has to do with what we saw in that prayer to the dead ancestors, to the kith and kin, a few pages ago from Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, and this was also true among the Canaanites and the Arameans, you prayed to your ancestors, your dead ancestors, so that they could help you. You helped them, you took care of them, and they would take care of you. And actually, one of the words in Canaanite for a dead ancestor is Elohim, which just means gods. Gods in the plural with a small g. One of the ways that you refer to your dead ancestors are they are the gods. That makes sense because you would pray to them, you would take care of them, you would offer them sacrifices, you offered them food in the hope that they would help you. Now, a central idea of the whole Hebrew Bible, the idea that starts off the Ten Commandments is you're not allowed to have a relationship with any other gods. Thou shalt have no gods besides me. Lo yehi elecha Elohim acherim al panai. Another way of translating that might be just, you are not allowed to have relationships with other Elohim, other gods. In a world where their neighbors and ancestors referred to their deified ancestors as gods, as Elohim, it was impossible for the biblical authors to talk about life after death without going afoul of the Decalogue, of the very beginning of the Decalogue. It was impossible to talk about life after death while also sounding like a monotheist. Once you're talking about these dead ancestors who are often called Elohim and to whom people make offerings and to whom people pray or speak or make requests, well, once you're talking about that, you've entered the realm of paganism. You've entered the realm that Israelites are not supposed to enter. I think that the biblical authors did believe in a concept of life after death, but they didn't know how to talk about it without sounding polytheistic. And since their central idea was we're only allowed to have a relationship with the creator God, the God who made the universe, well, I just can't even talk about life after death, because if I start talking about it, I'm going to sound like I'm talking about Elohim Acherim, like I'm talking about other gods. So I think it's not that biblical authors don't believe in the afterlife, it's that they don't know how to talk about it without sounding pagan. And that's the reason we find so little about the afterlife in the Hebrew Bible. I think the authors believed that there was such a thing as the afterlife, and occasionally while talking about some other topic, they come up against it and they make some kind of side remark about the afterlife, but they can't really discuss it at length because though they believe that their ancestors went somewhere, they also believe we're not allowed to talk to our ancestors. We're not allowed to feed them. God will take care of them, but we're not allowed to do anything like that because if we're feeding them, that sure looks a whole lot like sacrificing to other gods. It looks a lot like worshiping other deities. One last remark, or two last remarks about these ideas of the afterlife and what happens to them later. An idea of the afterlife, and in particular the idea of bodily resurrection, becomes absolutely central to many, though not all, kinds of Judaism in the Second Temple period. That is the period that, roughly the period when Jesus lived, going 400 years earlier and about 100 years later. During that period, the idea of an afterlife, and in particular bodily resurrection, becomes an important idea. In Rabbinic Judaism, for example, the central prayer of Rabbinic Judaism, recited several times every day, is called the Amidah prayer. The second paragraph of the Amidah prayer says, of God, you are extraordinarily mighty, you bring the dead back to life. And it actually says you bring the dead back to life about 5 or 6 times in the space of a short paragraph. Mechaye metim is the Hebrew phrase. And the paragraph ends with the phrase, blessed are you, O God, Mechaye hamitim, the one who brings the dead back to life. For traditional Rabbinic Judaism, this becomes a central theme. And I think that in part what I'm pointing out is some continuity between the rabbis and the Bible. A lot of people think of the rabbis as introducing a radical new theme when they talk about resurrection, but what I've tried to show is that that's not necessarily the case. The idea was already there. It's just that by the time of the rabbis, the fight against polytheism had been won. And so they could sort of start talking about this theme without being anxiety-ridden that they sound too pagan. Even before the rabbis, I think that's already happening, that Jewish authors are talking about life after death, because the fight against paganism has been won, and so it becomes a central theme in rabbinic worship, a central theme in the rabbinic prayer book. But there's a difference in the rabbinic and the early Christian way of understanding this theme, because what's interesting, you may have noticed, I don't know if some of you were wondering about this, the ancient Near Eastern idea found among the Canaanites, the Arameans, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and I think the Israelites, the idea is completely amoral. Life after death depends on having a good burial, sons, and or a plot of land. And if you're a bad person but you have sons, apparently you've got a good chance. And if you're a good person and you don't have sons, you're in trouble. That's why the daughters of Tzlofchad want to intervene and get a change in the rules so that their father won't be in that kind of trouble. There's a separation between morality and the nature of the afterlife. It's actually a somewhat surprising or disturbing idea of the afterlife in that it has nothing to do with justice or divine mercy. It just has its own rules, and here's how it works. In early Christianity, in Rabbinic Judaism, in some other forms of Second Temple period Judaism, this is changed, and the afterlife becomes a matter of either divine justice or divine mercy, or a bit of both. That is, you can be judged for how you behave during your lifetime, and your fate in the afterlife will depend not on whether you had sons, not on your real estate situation, not on your bad luck of dying in the middle of the desert where there's nobody to bury you. Your fate in the afterlife will depend on how you were loyal to God, how you treated other human beings. That's a revolutionary idea. What's revolutionary in Second Temple period Judaism and early Christianity, in Rabbinic Judaism, isn't the idea of the afterlife. That was already there in ancient Israel. It's the moralization of the afterlife, that the afterlife has to do with justice, and or the afterlife has to do with divine mercy. That is, maybe God will give you a good afterlife even though you didn't have sons. And maybe you made some bad mistakes, but maybe God will forgive you and you'll still have a good afterlife. Or maybe there's a mixture. One common idea in rabbinic literature that becomes fairly standard in Judaism is that there is punishment and there is reward, but that the longest period of punishment for a very evil human being is 12 months. And after 12 months, you're rescued from that punishment, and divine mercy then eternally trumps divine justice, and you end up having a good afterlife. By the way, that's the reason for the common custom among many Jews that we recite the Kaddish prayer for our parents after they die. We only recite it for 11 months, not 12 months of the full mourning period, because we don't want to imply that our parents need the full 12 months worth of help. The purpose of the Kaddish prayer is to sort of get them out of that punishment. The original purpose, maybe not the reason that we say it today, but the original purpose was to get them out of that punishment a bit earlier by creating merit, by reciting this prayer. That kind of goes to their account. You don't want to imply that they need 12 months worth of help. And that's why, even though the mourning period lasts 12 months for a parent, we only say the prayer for 11 months. One last note. While we're talking about prayers, I just want to point out what for many Jews is a familiar prayer, the Yizkor prayer. This is a prayer that began to be recited, or at least it shows up in the textual record, in the 12th century or 13th century CE in the Rhineland in Germany. When the Crusaders go through the Rhineland on their way to the Holy Land, they realized, why wait to start killing infidels now when we got plenty of them right here? And there were horrific massacres in the Rhineland, and at that massacres of Jews, that is. The Jewish communities were decimated by these massacres, and they started to say a prayer on the anniversary of the massacres in memory of the people who had been killed. It's called the Yizkor prayer. And then this custom spreads beyond the Rhineland. It spreads beyond people who were killed by Crusaders. It eventually becomes something that Jews say, Ashkenazic Jews, that is European Jews, and Italian Jews say annually, or actually 4 times a year, for their parents. There's somewhat different customs, either annually or 4 times a year. The language of this prayer that we recite for our parents is interesting in 2 respects. One, it's the same language that we saw in some of those Aramaic and Phoenician inscriptions, actually in particular the Aramaic inscriptions. So in the Italian version of this rite, for example, one says, "May God remember the soul of so-and-so who has gone on to life in the world to come." The Hebrew there is Yizkor Elohim Nefesh. May God, Yizkor, remember or mention the soul, Nefesh, of the parent. And then we have a reference at the end there to, we do this on the day of the person's remembrance, Pekudata, her remembrance, or Pekudato. Those are all vocabulary items that we saw in those ancient Near Eastern texts. The ancient Near Eastern text, for example, Gilgamesh, talks about the pakid, the person who recites the name or remembers the name. Some of the other texts, the Aramaic text, talks about how the son should mention or remember his father's nefesh. We're getting the exact same vocabulary items in this text that shows up suddenly in the Middle Ages. I think that this Jewish custom of reciting Yizkor didn't begin in the 12th century. I think it's just showing up in our textual record. But the truth is, Yizkor preserves ancient Near Eastern rituals on behalf of a parent that go back into the 8th century BC, go back as far as the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is from before the time when they were ancient Israelites. Gilgamesh is a pre-biblical text. The other text that mentions the Pakid, we actually didn't look at that, that's also a pre-biblical text. Jews who are reciting Yizkor, actually, even Jews who don't go to synagogue very often do make a point of reciting Yizkor, going to synagogue on the days that Yizkor is recited, are actually preserving an ancient Near Eastern custom relating to one's parents that goes back from actually not just the time of the beginning of the Jewish people, but even before the time of the beginning of the Jewish people. It's an extraordinary example of cultural continuity that spans millennia. They're using the same vocabulary with one interesting difference. In the ancient Near East, the son who was pakid or zocher, who mentioned or remembered the parent, by reciting the name out loud, I think that the son was performing a magical ritual that helped give the father and the mother greater substance. By saying the name, the person was performing magic, that is, names had power. The recitation of the name in a certain way or in a certain context actually helped the soul of the dead person. The rabbinic version of the Yizkor prayer, which Jews recite, changes the subject of the verb. The son doesn't mention the name. Rather, the children of the dead person say, Yizkor Elohim, Nefesh Avi Mori, and so forth and so on. May God remember, or God mention the name of my dead parent, and then you actually say the name out loud. But now the magic is no longer being performed by the son. The magic is being performed by God, who's allowed to do magic. That's like what God does for a living. It's no longer that we human beings are performing magic. The human being reciting Yizkor is asking God to do this extraordinary thing of resurrecting the parent or keeping the parent alive. So we're getting some extraordinary continuity with the ancient Near East in this contemporary Jewish custom, which began to show up in the textual record in the 12th century, but I think goes back much further and is still performed. I'm sure there are many people in this room who have recited Yizkor for their parents. There's extraordinary continuity with the ancient Near East, and then there's an important theological difference in that it's no longer the human being who is performing this magic, but the human being is praying to God to mercifully or justly give the parent a benefit, a happy, a decent afterlife. Okay, we've looked at a whole bunch of texts. I think I'll go as far as that and see if there's time for if there's some questions. Thank you very much.
There is some time for questions. We'll try to use mics to serve you, so please put your hand up.
Thank you for your lecture. I am interested when you talk about, I'm Jewish, the Yizkor prayer and the cultural continuity. I'm curious why the lineage starts with Abraham, and they mention the Garden of Eden. I don't know, because I know that Noah was a righteous man, and I don't know how can we use the Garden of Eden symbolism, yet it starts with Abraham? Is there a historical reason for that?
Yeah, interesting question. So I'll just repeat the questions since the mic was not really cooperating. The question was, so the Yizkor prayer that we've got in both versions, the Italian and the Ashkenazic or German version on page 5, mentions the Garden of Eden, and then it mentions Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. That seems a little bit off. The characters in the Garden of Eden were Adam and Eve. So why not mention Adam and Eve? Why mention Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? I think that on the one hand, it made sense to mention the Garden of Eden because the Garden of Eden comes to be associated with ideas of eternal life, because back when we human beings lived in the Garden of Eden, we had access to eternal life. We lost it when we got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. But maybe if there is some sort of afterlife, then literally or symbolically, we do get to go back to the Garden of Eden, and that expulsion eventually will be undone, will be reversed. So I think that's why the Garden of Eden is mentioned here as this pleasant place for a human being to spend eternity, which may have been God's initial intention. That was, that we're supposed to be there forever. Why then mention Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob rather than Adam and Eve, or let's say Noah going a little further? Although Adam and Eve really is what we would think about if we're talking about Eden. I think that the reason that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are mentioned, because that's where the Jewish family begins. Adam and Eve, and also Noah, and Mrs. Noah, whose name we never find out, but they're the ancestors of all human beings. I mean, when the rabbis talk about, especially Adam and Eve, they use Adam and Eve as the way of proving that ultimately no human being is better than any other. That is, that it's not that your family is more prestigious or more noble or something. Ultimately, we all have the same ancestors. We all go back to Adam and Eve. We also all go back to Noah, according to the Bible. So Adam and Eve are used to talk about human beings and some sort of equality of all human families. But Yizkor is about your own family, is about your parents. And I think that they're going to the first parents, the first Jewish parents, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where the Jewish family, the Jewish extended family that becomes the Jewish nation, the nation Israel, where they come from. Insofar as Yizkor is a very familial ritual, and all of these death rituals, back in the ancient Near East, they were very much a familial ritual. You're responsible for your own ancestors. So I think that they're going with the patriarchs and matriarchs from later in the book of Genesis, because that is something more familial, whereas Adam and Eve and Noah are much more universal. Tim?
All right. Well, thank you, Professor, for that wonderful lecture. Thank you for coming from the city of New York. I went to a school on 116th Street there, but a lot of people did. So pardon me for that little introduction.
6 blocks away from where I teach, just in case people didn't figure that out.
I used to walk. Anyway, the places, Sheol being this mysterious place. And I thought during the talk a little of Hashamayim V'et Haaretz. And what does Hashamayim mean in the tradition? Because we, at least myself, many other Jews, don't think of going to heaven in terms of life. There may be Gan Eden, it's a connection to land, it's a connection to this magical, mystical place, if people believe literally. But what is Hashamayim? And then Haaretz and Sheol, is it a matter of what's above, what's below? Is there an idea of that? Does it have something to do with what you've been teaching us today?
So, in other words, one might ask not just what happens to a human being after death, but where do they go? Where do we go? And it's very, very hard, I think just impossible to give a systematic answer to this, whether we're talking about biblical texts or rabbinic texts, because the texts aren't consistent. They don't have one picture. In the case of, so they don't always agree with each other. There's more than one conception floating out there. The biblical texts, it's even harder because they only refer to the idea in passing when they're talking about something else. So it's hard to know, literally speaking, how they were picturing this. When we get to the rabbinic texts, there are some texts that get into a little bit more detail, but they're not self-consistent. I mean, I don't think the rabbis were interested in self-consistency. They're sort of painting a number of impressionistic pictures And the truth probably is something you'll gain by looking at these different pictures, but we shouldn't take the pictures necessarily literally. Sheol, where was Sheol? There is this idea of going down to Sheol. So I think that there is this idea that an unpleasant afterlife is somewhere dry and dusty way beneath us. And that's probably what Sheol is, an unpleasant place to spend eternity. But where did the other people go? In some of these, at least in some of the Phoenician and Aramaean texts, they seem to be in the realm of the gods. They seem to be low-ranking gods in the realm of the gods. So maybe they're going somewhere up rather than down. There are plenty of other Mesopotamian texts and Greek texts that make it clear that no, human beings do go down underneath the ground. There are a number of different pictures, and I don't think that we can't extract from them one self-consistent picture. There's also the question of, does the soul continue to exist, or does it come back at some point in time when God decides to resurrect everybody? And I think that you find both ideas showing up in ancient Jewish texts, in Second Temple period and rabbinic texts. You sometimes have an idea that there is some sort of neshama or nefesh which continues to endure. That is, you get the idea of the immortality of the soul. But also very, very clearly you get in rabbinic texts an emphasis on the idea that we'll come back in embodied form. Our bodies will come back. Until then, we're asleep. Even in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, that latest book of the Bible, there's a reference to those who sleep in the dust being awakened. So apparently, like, in the interim, you were just asleep. The question of where you were isn't all that important. You'll come back. There are a lot of these different pictures, and I think that it's characteristic of rabbinic Judaism and even of biblical Judaism that there is no systematizing. There is no attempt to really do what, let's say, Dante does, to give you one long poem that explains everything, describes all the different places based on tradition. Dante wasn't making this stuff up. He's using traditions that are out there in Latin and in Greek. That systematizing tendency is not so prominent in Judaism, and I don't think that anyone ever really systematizes the ideas of the afterlife to produce one answer to this. Or if there are people who do systematize in that way, the system never catches on among widely in Jewish communities.
Okay, so I found this very interesting, but I'm perplexed by one thing. Every morning we say, right? We're saying to God that we're praising Him for restoring our soul to our lifeless, exhausted body.
Mm-hmm.
So the implication there is that the soul is definitely separate from the body because it leaves the body at night. It returns to you in the morning, hopefully, right? And what you're implying is that the body and the soul have some kind of still a link. And in Judaism, at least I grew up very Orthodox, so I don't see that. And I don't know about Rabbi Zimmelman and Rabbi Bloom here, but I don't see it.
I think in both the ancient, clearly in the ancient Near Eastern texts outside the Bible, there is some sort of intimate magical connection between the remains of the body and some object that is described as being ephemeral or like a wind or like a breath of air. Sometimes the terms used is ruach, neshama, nefesh. In various languages, the vowels might be different, but it's always the same. It's always the same term. There's clearly some sort of magical connection between the remains of the body and that ephemeral breath-like thing that endures after death. If the body is not in good condition, then that ephemeral thing will not be in good condition either. I think that ancient Israelites were assuming basically the same picture, that there was some sort of breath in the body that leaves the body at death, but it probably is still connected to the remains of the body. That's a belief that they share with all their neighbors. They haven't developed any distinctive Israelite belief. They're just going with the default value of their wider culture in the ancient Near East. Later in Judaism, you get more and more of an idea of a soul that is separate from the body. But Judaism never loses that original ancient Near Eastern conception that body and soul are very intimately linked. I mean, a lot of people make the claim about Judaism, at least rabbinic Judaism and biblical Judaism, pre-medieval Judaism, that Greek-style dualism doesn't exist among Jews. That there, this idea that there is a soul separate from the body, that's just not a Jewish idea, and that's why Jews believe in the resurrection of the body. Because to have eternal life means that we'll have something like this. And miraculously and mercifully, God will give us that at some point in the future. If there is no dualism between soul and body, then the only kind of afterlife you can believe in is resurrection of the body, which is the traditional Jewish form of afterlife belief. On the other hand, I think that idea that Jews didn't have an idea of dualism has been overplayed. There are indications that, they did think that there was this thing that was separate from the body, that could leave the body and come back. There's a passage in Ezekiel that seems to indicate this, very, very complicated passage in Ezekiel. Some of the rabbinic prayers seem to be assuming this. Another prayer recited in the morning, Elohai neshamash natata bi tohorahi, O Lord, the spirit or the breath that you put in me is pure. Then it says that eventually that breath will leave us, but God will bring it back to us because God is the one who will bring breath or soul back to dead corpses. So there you're still getting that connection, but there is this idea that there is a connection between soul and body, but there is something referred to as the neshama that maybe is sometimes separate from the body. Again, I think ultimately in rabbinic Judaism, this doesn't get systematized. And it's hard to sort of summarize these ideas in a way that does justice to all of the texts that are out there, even just in the rabbinic prayer book, much less the texts that are out there in the Talmud, let's say, because there's no one summary that will fit them all. I think Jewish theology has tended to avoid systematizing, and even when there have been systematizers like Maimonides, their systematization has been very, very controversial, and ultimately their systematization, even for a thinker like Maimonides, who is revered, his system is never fully accepted among Jews. So I think there's any good summary that a person gives you of a central set of Jewish ideas, a person who's knowledgeable will probably be able to think of some texts that don't really fit that summary. Judaism is not a religion that lends itself to summaries that are all-encompassing because of this rabbinic aversion, I think, to systematization. Thank you.